to the color manager. The last of the four managers, we have file manager, layer manager, mask manager, and color manager. Notice no image view selected here, so it's not until I open a band that the color manager comes into play. I have here an SST image from Veers. I have reprojected it, and I have actually subset it down to a smaller area. You can see here. So if I go to the color manager now with the window open, I am seeing the color manager user interface for this open image. If I had multiple images open with various bands and various data types, if I chose another one and selected it and then looked at the color manager, this information would generally change. But for the one we're working on here, an SST, you can kind of notice that it's rendered it out in color in a sort of default set of colors, and it's not a very good rendition. So being able to manipulate the color palette and its rendition of the data is important. Now, what is a color palette? It's simply a mapping of data values to pixel colors. So it's basically a table. And what CDAS does here, if I widen this a little, is gives me three ways to view the color palette information. By default, the basic view allows for the selection of a scheme, which is simply a predetermined setup of a color palette to a data type. So depending upon the product that I'm viewing, I can choose the scheme and get a color palette that CDAS deems appropriate for that particular data type. If I were looking at the row sub S as, for example, I could choose a gray, a red, or whatever rendition, water leaving radiances. The fact that I'm looking at an SST file, CDAS was able to determine and chose the SST scheme for me, which gives me a universal blue-red color palette to render out the data. I can, with this reverse button, flip the mapping from red to blue for the minimum to maximum data values, or flip it back so that it's blue to red as the mapping of data values. Below this is the range, which is the most important really tool in the tool chest of the color manager. It allows me to pick the actual range of values of data that are mapped to this lowest, if you will, color to the highest, if you will, color. It's chosen some defaults here, which really account for the rather poor rendition here. I can click this set from band data, and it will interrogate the data that I'm looking at, find its minimum value and its maximum value. Now I'm mapping from roughly -5 degrees to roughly 27 degrees over the blue to the red. And what you find is that, well, there's not much data that's this cold. So if I elevate that, let's say to 10 degrees, all of a sudden we're looking at a pretty good rendition of the data. So we can clean this up, maybe make this 28. If we notice as I go higher, if I change from 10 to 12, what happens to the blues? Well, they get a little darker blue. So we're bringing in, we're compressing the data range across the entirety of the color palette. If I raise this to 35, just to exaggerate, now I've asked it to try to map the highest color to some temperatures that exceed the range of data values. If I bring it way back in the other direction to 20, so now the high colors are accounted for in a great deal of the data range. So you can set from band data to get an approximation, and then you can kind of clean this up. And you want to clean this up because, very importantly, when you fix these values and get this color rendition, if you later choose to export other and a color bar for annotating this image, if I preview that, you'll notice it's using the minimum and maximum that I've chosen and the color palette that I've chosen. Okay, and so there are tools to control more about the you know, rendition of the color bar, but importantly, the values here are being related to the values I'm choosing in this range setting here. Additionally, the color manager allows me to view this color palette in other ways. One is the sliders, which are basically sliders assigned a value across the bottom here that are sort of mapped across the histogram of the data. I can compress that and change the mapping. There's no data way up here, so I can bring that in, and you can map color values perhaps you know, more optimally in this way. If I want to reset that, I simply click this top tool here. I can render out this histogram with a linear or a log axis, okay, which may or may not be useful. I believe in chlorophyll imagery this comes into play. I'll turn that off and I'll reset to get and then finally, you've got a table view which has fixed colors assigned to fixed values. There's some interpolation going on along here. If I were to change one of these, you know, if I click on this, I get the RGB values. If I were to, just to fully illustrate, if I were to blacken them out and zoom in, what you notice is you're getting all sorts of grades of blue. So it's interpolating from this value to that value with this color to that color. Okay, so just be aware of that. I don't know if, yeah, reset will bring us back to our color palette. So most often you'll set from band data and tweeze out some values that you like, 12 to 28, whatever. Right, and finally, in the color manager, the one last tool is down here in these options that can be displayed or not. And it's the no data color. This allows you to assign a color, which is by default none, meaning transparent, to anywhere in the image that there is no data assigned. If you look in the raster information window over here as I move the cursor around, it's giving the value under the cursor. But if I move over land, it says not a number, NaN. So there's not actually no data value in those raster elements of the image. It's true for some of the clouds here where the SST algorithm decided this can't be ocean, so I'm going to fill in a non-existent numeric value in there. You'll notice down here in the corner where the swath granule ends, there's no data. So if I were to import, for example, a land mask over this, it might colorize the land one color, but you could still highlight the missing data with its own color, and that can be useful in the final portrayal of your data. I believe that's really all that we need to say about the color manager. Generally, you'll be interacting with the basic. You may use a scheme to find an appropriate color palette. You can choose any color palette you want. So if you change it, it's going to behave in exactly the same way, mapping a minimum value and a maximum value to a minimum color and a maximum color, and you can get some very exotic results this way, which may or may not be useful. Finally, I would notice that if I hover over any of these color palettes, a tooltip appears that gives me a little bit of documentation about that color palette. And you notice some of these are labeling themselves as colorblind compliant or colorblind semi-compliant as an accessibility feature. But there is a variety of color palettes here. Um, Building your own custom color palette is a possibility, but not a very simple one to explain. It's possible to modify an existing color palette and then save it out as here, but that's beyond the scope of this particular video. I just want to make sure you know how to get to the basic color palette manager and make good use of it.